In this lesson we're going to create the shader for our tablecloth and we're going to talk about textures. So let's just assign this first of all. I'm going to select this guy. Go to rendering and assign a favorite material, and you can see I've got my AI materials here now because we added them earlier, and I'm going to just add a standard material to that. And then in the diffuse I'm going to map the color with a texture. So we're just going to grab a file texture, open that up, and inside the textures folder you can see you've got a bunch of textures that we've created, and so we're just going to come down to cloth color and just open that. So let's take a look. Let's minimize this. Okay, so there's our texture, and so what it does is when you first apply a texture, what Arnold will do is create a TX map for you. So a TX map is a special optimized version of your texture, and it's got two special aspects to it. The first one is that the textures will be tiled. So they'll be tiled into, I'll just show you the render settings here. Let's go to the texture section. So they'll be auto-tiled into 64 by 64 pixel tiles. So that means that it can access those 64 by 64 pixel tiles really easily. So if there is a part of the texture in the view, let's say this part, it's not going to load up this part as well. It's only going to load up the texels that it needs. So that means that textures are faster to load, but they also use less memory, because if I had a texture for this entire table, and I'm only seeing this part of it, it's only going to load that part of it. Okay, so this is from RenderMan basically. RenderMan used to use these TX files, it still does use these TX files, and so it's very memory efficient, and also it's also good for speed as well. The other aspect about a TX map is that it is MIP mapped, so it means it's got multiple versions of the texture which are smaller and smaller and smaller, so that if your texture is seen in a little dot like this big as this tree, then it's going to load the smallest version of that texture, and that really saves a lot of time in terms of anti-aliasing. So otherwise it would have to, the computer would have to figure out how this texture looks when it's that small. Okay, so that's called MIP mapping. So all that stuff basically is done for you. You can see this little auto convert textures to TX is ticked on by default. So when you press render, it's going to create a TX file for you that's going to be tiled and MIP mapped. So it's going to look the same, but it's going to be optimized in terms of memory and performance and anti-aliasing. Okay, so in each of your file textures, your file nodes, excuse me, you've got an Arnold section, and inside there you've got you can pick a type of filtering. Okay, so you've got the best type to the worst type, so I just normally leave that onto the default. And then you've also got auto-generate TX textures on an individual basis. So if you don't want to recreate this texture, if let's say you're pressing render and then you deleted it by accident and you don't want to regenerate this, you can just turn this off and it won't create that. And then you've got this bias. So the higher this number is, the more likely Arnold is to use the low resolution version of that texture. Okay, so for example, let's see if it works here. So if I keep this render here, and then let's change this to 2, you can see that it's using a really low version of the texture now. You can see this is it's starting to look kind of mix into one color, because basically it's a lower resolution version of that texture. Let me try 4. So now you can see it's really blurry, and it's a much more blurred version. So it's really handy. So this is how you manually choose, you know, what version you want. I can just say 0 back to normal, so we get a nice sharp version. Okay, so that's the controls for that. And so let's just go back to the render settings here. So these tick boxes are generally, you don't have to touch them. I'll just show you what they are. you can actually turn off accept unmipmapped. So if you want to check whether your textures are mipmapped or not, you can turn this off and Arnold will give you an error, or it won't render the texture if it's not mipmapped. Okay, so you can check it by doing that. Also, accept untiled, you can check it by doing that as well. This is the cache size for the textures, so if you've got more textures you can increase this if you want to. And this is the limit on the number of open textures. By default Arnold handles that, but you can type in a number if you want to, and you can blur the texture for diffuse and glossy rays. Okay, if you don't auto convert, then you've got the option to use existing textures. So for example, if you've got a JPEG in there, it's going to look for a TX version of that, and then it's going to use that instead. So you can, if you don't turn that on, then it's just going to use the regular JPEGs that it's got in applied, or whatever TIFF or whatever file format you've got applied, EXR. So I'll just turn this on. So for the most part you don't have to worry about this. When it does convert the texture, it should convert the color space as well. So it should update and apply the color space as well. There's a little utility in here. If we go to Arnold, Utilities and TX Manager, this shows you a list of the textures in your scene. So you can see we've got the background low, we've got the cloth that we just added, and we've got the background low for the image plane that we applied earlier. Okay, so by default it creates these TX files using this program called MakeTX, and these are the options for that MakeTX. It's if you want to know more about this, you can go into the help, and it's got all the commands in there. You don't really need to mess with it too much because it's got this nice interface, so you can create textures if you want to by using this interface. So let's say we wanted to delete the color that we just created. So be sure to not delete this stuff while it's rendering, otherwise it's going to crash. So if I press stop here and just close this up, and then we can say, if you wanted to recreate these, for example, you could select what you want and then say delete TX, and then you can recreate them. So the TX is here for this one. Just say delete. Can't delete it because it's using it, so I'll just grab these two and say create. So again, these parameters are in the help if you want to have a look. This is to do with the color correction, so if you don't want them to be gamma corrected, you can remove this flag if you want to. The default setting should work fine, so I'm just going to say create. I'm just showing you how to do this. Okay, and I'm going to close that. I'm just showing you how to do this just so you know how to do it manually. And you can even pick a folder and then put all your textures in a folder and then click create before you even start rendering, so that you don't have to do it afterwards. Okay, so if we were to open up the render view, you can see that we have our textures there. So let's have a look at the shader. So I'm just going to adjust this a little bit. If I go in here and come down to this section here, we haven't actually named it cloth shader, so let's just name that. Okay, and what we'll do is put some bump in here as well, so I'm just going to go to bump mapping, another file, and we're just going to pick the cloth bump. Just update the scene here. Okay, ordinarily we would adjust the amount of bump, but I'm not going to do that right now because I've already baked it into the texture, so it should be correct in terms of the amount. If you wanted to, you can come in here and say put this up or down to increase the amount of bump there. Okay, so we could also have a bit of specular on this, so let's just see what that looks like. I'm not sure if it's going to be too shiny, but let's just have a look. If I go to specular, and let's just grab a region like this, and we could go to, just turn this up a little bit. I'm going to say isolate selected, and then just select the cloth here. Okay, so because we've got light coming from all around, we're getting quite a strong highlight there. So I'll leave it like that for now. In this lesson we set up our shader for the tablecloth, and we had a detailed look at TX maps and what they are.